Hello, we're still in Unit 3.5 on learning, and this is section 3.53, where we're extending out a little bit more with classical conditioning. My Bitmoji is hanging out there with Pavlov's dog. Let's get started. So, reviewing quickly the Pavlov experiment and some of those terms we talked about in the last section. Before conditioning, we had a neutral stimulus, the tuning fork or the bell or the tone that triggered no response. We also had an unconditioned stimulus, something that was unlearned, the food or meat powder that triggered an unconditioned response of salivation. During conditioning, Pavlov paired the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus together, and it created a response of salivation. After conditioning, we only needed the new conditioned stimulus of the bell to trigger the response of salivation, and that becomes a conditioned response. Once the dog is salivating to the bell, that he has reached the stage we know as acquisition. And if he were to stop pairing those together, then extinction could occur. And if the behavior came back, then we know that that is spontaneous recovery. Pavlov experimented further with stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. So he wanted to know, did it have to just be that one tuning fork that would get the response? So he experimented with similar objects. What he found was if he still brought out the UCS, the unconditioned stimulus, with other similar conditioned stimuli, then he would still get the same response. So he could use different tones, like a bigger tuning fork or a smaller tuning fork, maybe a horn, other sounds. But as long as he taught the dog to hear that sound with the food, then he would still get a response. So he generalized the behavior. But he found he could also do the opposite. He could teach the dog to discriminate the behavior. If he would play a tuning fork and bring out the food, then the dog would drool. But if he would play the tuning fork but not, or play a horn and not bring any food, then the dog would learn, okay, plays horn, no food, tuning fork, food. So he would learn to discriminate between the two. So as long as the reward, I shouldn't say reward, the unconditioned stimulus was there with it, then the dog would have a response. He would learn to tell the difference between the tones. We'll do some more examples of discrimination and generalization in this section. So in classical conditioning, the ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and other stimuli that do not signal a UCS. So that's discrimination. So a few examples here. So we've got this couple here who maybe they've been going to Sonic for their dates, and they get onion rings and tater tots and milkshakes, and then they kiss. So that kiss is an unconditioned stimulus. It's going to automatically trigger some arousal. But that onion breath that they have is generally neutral. That onion breath doesn't really usually do anything for people. But if there's that onion breath followed by the kiss, and they've done this on multiple dates, onion breath plus kiss is creating sexual arousal, then eventually the onion breath alone could trigger that arousal. So I don't know about that, but through conditioning, that's possible. Now, if we wanted to use stimulus generalization, we could say that maybe they ate onion rings from Burger King and then they made out. And then they also ate onion rings from Sonic and then they made out. And onion rings from various places and then they made out. And then that conditioning would be that basically onion rings from anywhere could trigger arousal. Now, if they only made out after eating onion rings from Sonic, then that would be discrimination. This one's more of a real life example, nausea conditioning in cancer patients. So many of the medications that cancer patients take, unfortunately, make them very nauseous. They take the medication and the result is nausea. So when they're in the waiting room of the doctor's office is usually a neutral stimulus, but they're waiting there and then they take the drug and then they feel sick. They go to the waiting room, they take the drug, they feel sick. Eventually gets to the point where just being in the waiting room will make them sick. This becomes a problem so much so that a lot of people who are cancer patients have learned that they shouldn't eat their favorite foods before they take their medication because it'll trigger a taste aversion. Classical conditioning is actually used quite a bit in advertising. John Watson, who we know for the little Albert experiment, or if we haven't talked about him yet, then we will, or if you haven't got to that in class yet, then we will. We know that he was run out of psychology for having an affair with his research assistant, and he went into the field of advertising. So he brought a lot of these behaviorist and classical conditioning principles to advertising. But so often, companies are going to link their brand name with a celebrity, with the celebrity being the unconditioned stimulus, that maybe you already like Taylor Swift and Diet Coke was neutral to you, but you pair those together, you like Taylor Swift, oh, okay, maybe I'll try Diet Coke. Same thing with types of perfume, clothing, music that they play in stores. So much of that is from associations. But Taylor Swift does something bad and messes up her reputation, then immediately those companies want to cut her off because they don't want you to associate her negatively with the product. But lots of classical conditioning in advertising. I've got another example here. Maybe at your house, if somebody flushes the toilet while you're in the shower, in a lot of houses, the water gets really hot and it'll burn you in the shower. So in this case, the hot water would be our unconditioned stimulus, and you would naturally jump back because you're getting burned, so flinching to the hot water. Neutral stimulus would be a toilet flushing. Generally, toilet flushing doesn't really cause any kind of fear or wincing. But when you have that toilet flushing, plus the hot water, and you jump back. So till eventually, if that keeps happening multiple times where the toilet flushes and you get burned, toilet flush, burned, then eventually just hearing the toilet flush would cause you to jump back. Now, if we were going to do generalization with this one, generalization would be if you got burned every time you took a shower in any house and the toilet flushed. Now, if you only got burned in your own house, then that would be discrimination. Higher order conditioning. So sometimes we take it a step further, that you've learned that you create this conditioned stimulus, but then that conditioned stimulus can create a new behavior. So here we've got a couple examples. In Pavlov's case, we know that the bell becomes a conditioned stimulus and it creates the conditioned response of salivation. But if we could use the bell, the dog knows if I see the bell, he's going to salivate. Sees the bell, he salivates. Now we can pair that with a flashing light, and then he'll salivate to either the flashing light or the bell. This is higher order because the bell is not a true unconditioned stimulus. The bell already has a learned value. Another example of this that maybe is a little bit more realistic here for us to understand is that we smell a hamburger, we salivate. We see this restaurant, we don't necessarily have a response, but you pair that restaurant with that burger, eventually you salivate to just seeing the restaurant. So now the restaurant is a conditioned stimulus. Well, what if that restaurant happens to have golden arches on it? Then you see golden arches, you go to the restaurant, you salivate. See golden arches, go to the restaurant, you salivate. Eventually, you're salivating just to seeing golden arches. Now, if you were to salivate anytime you saw the letter M, that could be generalization. If you only salivated to giant golden letter M's that are on signs, then that would be discrimination. Classical conditioning shows up quite a bit. We'll talk about here in the next example, prejudice. A lot of our phobias, if you've been bit by a dog, then you learn to associate it with pain. And if you're scared of all dogs, that's generalization. If you're only scared of a Chihuahua because you got bit by a Chihuahua once, that's discrimination. All right, so here how a person may learn prejudice through classical conditioning. So let's use an example. I don't want to use a real example, so I'm going to use triangle people and circle people. So let's say that triangle people are a disliked group or a member of a disliked group. So triangle people here, when a child sees a triangle person, initially they have no response. They've never seen a triangle person before, they're fine. However, the parent, for whatever reason, does not like triangle people, and the parents have a very strong negative reaction. Parents being mean is scary, so that's an unconditioned stimulus, and the child is fearful or upset to the parent's response, which is to the triangle people. We'll call the parents circle people. So The child sees a triangle person, the circle parent gets angry, the child is scared of the angry parent. Child sees triangle people, parent is angry, child is scared of the parent's anger. So, after conditioning, eventually the child sees the triangle person and they become fearful and upset, even without the presence of the parent's anger. So, there are other ways prejudice is learned, but this is how it could happen through conditioning. So, that's why setting the example of the parent makes such a big difference there.